Are these on?
I don't think, oh, it is on.
Ooh. We were saying these look like weapons, so if I don't get the right answer, Lee, watch out. I have to say, Lee, that I loved both of your books, and thank you to Mary, because she's the one who turned me on to you.
Thank you, Mary.
I think your backstory is a great way of kind of leading into what led you into writing about special ops and CIA, because I think it's fascinating for a woman's voice to be as the storyteller in both of your novels.
Well, I didn't think I was going to be a writer, and my father died 10 years ago, and 2 days after he died, the former head of the FBI showed up at my mother's house along with the, sorry, a friend of mine just walked in, along with the then Chief Justice of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, something I didn't even know existed. And these two judges showed up at my mother's house with a document that then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had helped get declassified. Later on, after I got into this world, I would see many documents like this, but I certainly never expected to see one related to my own father. It was a Bronze Star citation for a mission that my father had led. And in that citation was this phrase, special operations. And I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded kind of interesting. My father had never talked to me about that time in his life for a number of reasons. And so I set out to try and understand, what is this thing, United States Special Operations? And started reading everything I could on that subject, and started seeing my bookshelf fill up with books by men, about men, and largely written for men. And I loved so many of the books that I read, but I did think maybe I could write a different kind of story. One of the books that I read at that time, which many of you may know, is a book called Lone Survivor, which was a memoir written by a Navy SEAL called Marcus Luttrell, and it was about his experience of going missing, essentially, and in Afghanistan. But the part of the book that resonated with me was near the end of the book. He wrote about coming home to Texas to understand what had happened in his family home while he was gone, and what had happened in that home was that home had filled up with people. The entire town, at least this is my recollection of it, formed a kind of vigil in his parents' home while they were waiting for news of their son. And I remember asking myself at the time, my mother had my brother when she was 19 years old, and I remember thinking, if I was the young mother of a young officer who'd gone missing and my house was filled with people, what would I want to do? And I thought I'd want to get out of that house. So I wrote essentially a short story after an agent that I knew had said, you should try writing fiction. And the short story was about a mother whose son has gone missing, and she goes for a run through a number of neighboring yards. And while she's running, she's asking herself, how did I get to this place? How did my son get into this world that was so foreign to me? She's essentially asking herself what I was asking myself after my father died. And that book became 11 Days. And as we talked a little bit about earlier, after that book came out, because I had kind of focused on the Navy SEAL team community, which is a very, a pretty closed community, I had a few calls from folks who were affiliated with CIA, wondering how I had gotten into that community. And I'll just repeat one story from this morning, which is that I think after the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in May of 2011, lots of journalists were trying to figure out the Navy SEAL team community, and I myself was completely uncredentialed. No one had ever heard of me. I hadn't written a book. I was a woman and I was pregnant. And when I showed up in these at a base or to speak to folks in that community, I wasn't interested in knowing who was in the room when bin Laden died, or I was interested in the training, but I wasn't asking questions to break news. What I wanted to know about were things like, what is your relationship with your mother like? Or how many times do you Skype your girlfriend from the base when you're deployed? Or what do you do to self-medicate given the stresses of these jobs? And I invariably found that after I'd spoken to someone about their mother, their girlfriend, and their addiction, I would get up to leave the interview and they would say, wait, don't you want to hear about the such and such raid? And I would get these sort of anecdotes at the end of my interviews, and I tried to work some of those into the book. And after it came out, I had the experience of thinking about whether I could write about a similar kind of community, and I thought maybe the intelligence world would be a good choice. And so I just started talking to people and trying to learn in the same way, really what the emotional makeup of someone in that line of work is, really what the character of someone in that line of work needs to be.
So you weren't aware that your father was in Special Forces at all throughout your whole growing up?
Well, just to be specific about it, it wasn't that he hid it, and he was not involved in it at all when I was growing up. My parents had an age difference, and so by the time I was growing up, my father was a lawyer in private practice, and no, it was less that he had some secret past and more that he hadn't discussed it. And I had been too naive or disinterested to ever ask, what did you do 40 years ago? And it's one of the reasons that I tell, folks I know in my generation who have served in these wars, write it down, write down your stories or record your stories, because your children may not have the facility to understand about it now, but they may want to know in 30 years, what did you do in 2004 in the Battle of Fallujah, or what did you do in these other periods, and you may forget. So I think recording these experiences is important. My father, I later found out, also had written copious letters home, mainly to his own mother. He couldn't go into a lot of detail about his work in those letters, but he did he did have experiences and he did have emotions about them. Unfortunately, by the time I was ready to have that conversation with him, he was no longer alive.
And in this book also, I see it so much as relationships, right? I mean, that's how I read it, although I found the idea of secrecy, which we all know happens within those organizations, but also happens within relationships, what we don't say. If you haven't read the book, and maybe, it's a story of Anna and her father, Noel, who is in the CIA. She is an only child, and she has been abandoned by her mother. To me, there was so much right there that, Noel's secrets were not revealed until he dies at her wedding. I mean, really. And then someone comes to tell you the secrets. Or the character, the secrets.
Someone had said to me very early on, when I was just sort of looking into the subject matter, Lee, asking someone to betray their country is actually pretty similar to asking someone to marry you, because in both cases, there's a lot of risk involved in the answer. And in both cases, you don't ask the question until you know what the answer will be. And when I heard that, I sort of thought, maybe I can write about marriage as a kind of metaphor for CIA. And I was thinking I really wanted to write about a marriage, a happy marriage. And I also wanted to understand how, when you're a child, you see your parents in a certain way, and they may go through lots of things that you can't possibly imagine. And then it's only when you are older that you're able to see them differently. So in the book, Anna's mother, yes, does leave her to be raised by her father, who's a very charismatic, successful businessman. And they have this magical relationship. So I was interested in the father-daughter relationship. But later on, she does realize that her mother abandoned her less, I think, because she wasn't up to the job of being a mother, but because being with a man with that level of charisma and secrets had been too much for her. So I also wanted to look at, a young happy marriage, which is Anna's marriage at the start, and how she processes her parents and all of the secrets that are involved in anyone's family story. seemed an interesting parallel for all of the secrets that you encounter in the classic espionage genre.
And Anna picks to marry a guy who's in the music business. What she thinks that she's getting is, this guy that's dealing out in the music business. And what does he become? A politician. I think that was so interesting to me because when you think of politicians, you also think, at least today I do, secrets and lies. And so it, in some way, from my interpretation, and this is why I love talking to the writer, to see if that was intentional, that she also kept things from him. She had her own secrets. Like, it wasn't that, so in many ways, she was very much like her father. Her own internal dialogue, I felt, was never shared.
Yeah, I think they both keep secrets. I had once heard a story of a guy who dropped out of Brown and started a record company, and I always thought that sounded romantic, and one day I would write about that character. But then he didn't really fit in my espionage book, so I had to turn him into a politician. So I had to make his music company so successful that he sold it to the Chinese
for a lot of money,
and could then say to his wife, his new wife, guess what, I'm going to run for office, even though he had no prior political experience, didn't know if he was Republican or Democrat, and just had a lot of charisma. But that felt timely also.
Right.
And I had to force a campaign narrative into the plot, so I sort of backed into that. But yeah, I think there's a scene in the novel where Anna is kind of teasing her husband because he's, like many people we all know, on 7 mobile devices at once and scrolling Instagram while he's posting on Twitter. And that's his speed. That's his emotional speed. He needs to be doing 9 things at once. And she very playfully points to one of his devices and says, what's that, a drone? He says, no, that's my cordless whatever. And she goes to bed, and he then later comes into the bedroom, and he has open on her laptop this video playing, which is an interrogation of her father, which she's hidden from him. And she looks up at him in the bedroom, and he says, what's this, a drone? And that scene was, for me, that scene was kind of about, and yet he still loves her, So they keep secrets in their marriage, but they love each other deeply, and they understand. And he, I think, understands why she's trying to find who her father is, and he, in his own way, tries to help her.
And then, the spiritual life of the father. In those tapes, I found the recordings of him talking about, and then the room, there's God, and in the next room is where you go before you die, and then the next room is, and I was thinking, okay, it felt like he had a very strong spiritual life. Did you do that?
I did. There was a little bit of inspiration to that specific recurring sort of monologue that he has. Someone had shared a video with me, and it's a YouTube sort of 3-minute mini documentary that the family of a CIA officer who died very early on. He was one of the first people to die in these wars, died in a training exercise in Afghanistan. Then his family made this sort of documentary of his life. And it's so powerful. It's, there's the baby in the crib, and there are these sort of flashing lights, and then there are little brothers playing in the snow. And then there's a 10-year-old boy blowing out candles on a birthday cake, and then suddenly you're at high school graduation, then you're at Harvard graduation, then it's Harvard Law School graduation, then he's deploying into the military, and then there's a close-up of the memorial program, with George Tenet's name because he spoke at the memorial. And it just, as a mother, and as a mother of sons, I thought that's what happens in a life. And this documentary opens with this tiny boy, he can't be more than 5 or 6, talking about the rooms in heaven. Are there rooms in heaven? We've all had these conversations with our little toddlers where they say things and we think like, oh my God, you're gonna be the next Einstein, because they say the weirdest things. And this little boy is trying to talk about what are God's rooms? And clearly the parents have maybe read to him some of these passages from the Bible, and he's parroting back what he's heard. But this idea of there being rooms in heaven, and the idea that when Anna was little, her father, who has a wonderful imagination, would tell her about all the rooms in heaven. And then, not to spoil at the end, there's a room that he hasn't spoken to her about that she learns about. But she always had this idea in her head of these rooms, and the story of how those rooms worked was a powerful narrative for her that she connected to her dad.
Right. It's beautiful, actually. I really love that part of the novel. I did. The other part that was like, did he have to die on the wedding day? I mean, did Noel, the father, have to die in the avalanche? You're killing me with that.
Well, sometimes things are just silly plot things. Like, I didn't want to spend too much time in Switzerland. And
so you killed the guy off?
I got really, you can go down these research rabbit holes when you're writing a book, and I got really interested in like weather patterns in the Alps and the incidence of avalanches. And there's an avalanche on the cover of the book. And like, when would it be plausible to have an avalanche in this canton in Switzerland where her father has gone to live? And in theory, if she's getting married there, but it's a small wedding, so maybe it's only 2 days. There's a scene very early in the book of a very interesting wedding that takes place in Switzerland where they hang the Buddhist prayer flags. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and she kind of wants to replicate that experience. So she goes to Switzerland to be married, and then her father dies the day before the wedding. And there flashes back in the book to this moment, which, makes me think of my own father, but where he's standing behind her, and she's tried on her wedding dress, and this has been the person who's raised her, and he's standing behind her, and he's saying, I believe in you, I believe in you. And the thing is, this is a young woman who has never believed in herself. And her father is the one person who says, I believe in you. And after he dies, she's trying to figure out what belief means to her. And she gets there at the end, but it's kind of a journey. So so they basically essentially cancel the wedding.
And so she really doesn't have the understanding of what her father does until the stranger shows up.
That's right. So she goes, and I just wrote about it because I wanted to go there. She goes to the south of France with her husband.
I love that you get
I was
to do
reading
where
a lot of,
you want to go.
I was reading a lot of John le Carré. I'm like, he gets to go to such great places. So she and her husband go. It's not really a honeymoon, but they go for a trip to Cap d'Antibes, and she meets this man. Her husband's very busy on all his mobile phones doing his deals. So she meets a guy at the bar, and they just start talking. And then she later encounters the same person in the water, and she later encounters him that evening outside a restaurant. And are these interactions coincidental or not, and how much does she know? But you realize very soon that this guy is someone who worked for her father, who's trying to find the right way to tell her what her father did, and if her father was in fact a spy for us or a spy for someone else. And she doesn't know him, but he becomes her lifeline to her father. And because I was also interested in the idea of, one way to structure a book is to say it's about a marriage, but then this dashing young CIA officer comes in and the woman has an affair with him. But I thought it was kind of more interesting to have that relationship just rest in a very platonic space, where he's almost educating her on her father's history, while she's really madly in love with her husband, the guy she's with. She just can't share that information with him.
And also because he's running for political office.
That's right. That would be complicated.
That complicated. It's like that was the big scene where it's like, you've got to tell us everything about you. And because you're, as the wife in the novel, she's going to be put under that scrutiny of a political campaign. And her fear comes up that I'm going to be exposed and therefore expose my father. It seems to me that another major theme is, do we really know one another? Does anybody really know one another? And was that, did you have that in mind when you were writing it? Like, you don't really know, the child doesn't really know the father, doesn't really know the guy who's giving her, and really, in some ways, doesn't know the husband. I mean, she loves her husband, and more importantly, does she really know herself?
Well, I think there are always moments in any in my experience, relationship where someone you think you know presents you with a data point that completely throws your understanding of who they are. And that happens a lot in this book, within the context of a marriage, within the context of parents and children. You know, I'm thinking about this. There's a moment in the book where her mother does come back because now the political campaign's on and her husband is front and central in the news. And so the mother comes back to visit her, and she goes to their apartment in New York City, and she goes into the husband's closet, and he has like 85 suits perfectly hung in the closet, and they're all perfectly tailored. He's clearly OCD or whatever. And the shirts in like this closet, and the mother goes in the closet, and what she says to her daughter, Anna, is, God, does he even let you breathe? And Anna looks at her mother and she says, he taught me how to breathe. And it's like, what I was trying to show in that moment is like, you know, the mother has lost her emotional equity with her daughter to say, I know you. She doesn't know her anymore. And I mean, and I felt that to be true of a lot of moments in the book, that yes, and that's why, again, back to metaphors for the CIA world or espionage world, in that business, in my understanding of it, you, as a case officer, can have many different cover identities, and you're always trying to manage, you know, multiple sets of mobile phones or visas. You know, we've all seen this in other films and books. And I was really interested in this idea of, you know, where do we get our main sense of who we are from? Is it from where we went to school? Is it from where we go in the summertime? Is it from who our friends are? Are we a different person in different environments? And I think we are, to some extent, different people in different environments. And to be in CIA is just sort of a radical extension of that. So I wanted to see if Anna, in the same way that her husband has this big evolution, I wanted to give her the chance to transform into something different by the end of the book, which she does.
Which she does. Lie detector plays a big role in this book. I was fascinated, like, can you really fool them? And the patience and the sweat and what you can do, because obviously in the CIA, they're trying to find out if you're telling the truth. Did you do a lot of research on lie detector tests?
Well, I got interested in the polygraph for two reasons. A case officer who gave me a lot of time told me two things about the polygraph. One is that when you work at CIA, you are regularly polygraphed by your own organization, often on very short notice. And that sounded weird, like, shouldn't your own organization trust you? I was trying to imagine, like, if Goldman Sachs regularly polygraphed its managing directors, how that would go.
How would that go?
And not well. And two, the person who invented the polygraph was the author of the Wonder Woman cartoons. I mean, which is so weird and so fantastic, if I made that up. And so Wonder Woman, who I was Wonder Woman for Halloween every year from age 6 to like age 15. And her tool is her lasso. The magic golden lasso, it's the lasso of truth. And in the big budget movie that came out a few years ago, the whole opening sequence is about the lasso. When she catches you in her lasso, you can only tell the truth. So the idea of Wonder Woman's lasso is the polygraph, essentially. And but you can jigger with them. And the idea in the book is that the father walks out of the room in the middle of a polygraph. So I had also heard a story of someone at CIA who had just, you know, you have all these wires hooked into you, who just stood up and pulled off the wires and walked out and said, I'm not doing this. And in my book, it's her father who stands up and says, I'm not doing this. So yeah, I mean, I had quite a bit more about the polygraph in the first draft, and my editor said this is really boring. So I took it out, but it just seemed like an irresistible, again, metaphor for what are the circumstances that we place other people in order to get them to tell us the truth, or, by the way, a truth that we want to hear. how do we set up other people to tell us a truth that we want to hear, as we're all trying to figure out who's telling the truth today.
And who do we protect in not telling the truth, right?
Yes.
And who do we keep safe? Because our truth could get them into bad situations. You know, so writing for you is something that's like, it's your calling. You feel like this is what you're supposed to be doing.
I'm not sure what else I could do at the
With
moment.
two small children, right? But you're also in film and movies, and you wrote Mile 22.
I've written one film, and the story there was that, again, interesting that this sort of little germ of the idea of 11 Days came from the book Lone Survivor, and I didn't know anyone involved in that book. But when my book 11 Days came out, at an early event that I did, the film director and writer Peter Berg came because I think he was then researching what became a film he directed, Lone Survivor, based on that book. And the Navy SEAL team community is pretty insular, and he and I had met a lot of the same people. And he was like wanted to know how I had met these people, and he read the book, and then called me later and said, "Do you want to write a low-budget Asian action movie?" And I said, "I'm not sure I have the skill set to do that," but I was in no position to turn down a job. So anyway, it became something that wasn't a low-budget Asian action movie, but it was nonetheless a film set in Asia. And all I was told was, it has to be set in Asia. It has to involve roughly this many characters. Mark Wahlberg is going to be in it, but otherwise just write the story you want to write. And so I had pitched to him an idea of a story that I wanted to tell, which was imagining that a mother who had lost her child on 9/11 was then 10 years later invited into the Situation Room to watch live the killing of Osama bin Laden. We all saw that Situation Room. And it was really that one sentence that became, I wrote the script, and I was told at the time, there have to be 4 big action sequences, so just when you get to the point in the script where you think one of those will work, just write, there will be action here, and then we'll come back and teach you how to do that. And yeah, it was a very humbling experience, and when you have small kids, as many of you know, and when you're writing a book, you spend a lot of time alone or cleaning pasta off the floor, and so to work with other people was to just have colleagues. And even when they were all yelling at me, to have colleagues was really exciting. I welcomed it, and I had no idea what I was doing. So it was also just, it was a huge learning experience.
Well, as a writer, it's alone, right? So your creativity is coming from one place. Did you find from the creative process that working in collaboration changed the way that you created?
Yes, I feel like John Burnham Schwartz should answer this question for me. But it's, yes, because I had at any one time up to 35 people reading a scene that I would write and all weighing in.
That's rough.
And I learned how to, Peter Berg was very thoughtful in really teaching me how to even respond to that quantity of notes. And that kind of a film is just, it's a village. And I remember while we were working on it, this documentary came out on Netflix, which I highly recommend, called This Center Cannot Hold. And it was about Joan Didion, made by her nephew, Griffin Dunn. And before I had even seen it, Peter Berg saw it, and he called me and he said, you've got to see this documentary. And I watched it, and I said to him, what did you respond to in it? He really likes Didion, but he said, I really liked the part where she was asked about her screenwriting. And she said, well, screenwriting is really just making notes for the director. And he said, because don't you feel like that's what you did for me? And I said, I do. But it's that as a director's medium for that kind of a film in particular. So there's no amount of writing that can capture what it looks like when a Predator drone drops, a bomb and 15 cars explode, but that's part of that genre. So it was, and as I think I was telling you, my kids got to come and they thought that was kind of fun, so.
And 11 Days, maybe a TV series?
I hope so.
I hope so, too.
Thank you.
Well, maybe it's time to open it up for questions. I could talk to Lee all day, and you might get sick of me asking. Does anybody have questions for Lee? Sure, go ahead.
What's the rewrite process? Is it frustrating after you finish your first, the second version? Have you had enough, or is it you learn something from doing it?
On rewriting the book? Well, I read an interview actually with Joan Didion very early on working on this book, in which she described her working day as being split up into kind of two shifts. And one shift was in the morning. She would write whatever she could write, and then she would break to be with her child or do other things. And then in the evening, she would sit down again and rewrite or edit. And I just stole that rhythm. And
good one to steal from.
I know. And I really find rewriting rewarding. I like that part of the process. It's the blank page that's less fun.
Anyone else? How important is your editor?
Completely essential. Completely essential. She really took a chance on me, and she's very good. She's very restrained. She's very traditional. I sit in her office, and she makes little notes with a pencil.
Does that ever feel like you're in the principal's office and you're going to fail?
No.
Just hearing it, that's how I feel.
It feels like I'm in the office of someone much smarter and cooler and, knowledgeable than me, because I turned in something recently where this was like a 50-page document, and I had spent months working on it, and it was a lot of work. And the first page was just 3 sentences, which I was really proud of, those 3 sentences. I spent so much time on those 3 sentences. And I turned the thing in, and then, as I often do, like that night, I went back to just look at it one last time, and there was a typo in that second sentence. I thought, bloody hell. I mean, I read those 3 sentences 85 times or something, but it reminded me that you get a kind of, at least I get a kind of blindness. And so a great editor not only, gets little things like that, but you can have that same blindness to your tone. At least I can. And so, and I haven't written that much, so I'm still really learning.
Was 11 Days your first book?
Yes.
So, I mean, how fantastic did that feel to have your first book be published? I mean,
it was really overwhelming. I remember my publisher bought the book in August. I was having a baby the following March, and I went in to talk to my editor in September, and she said, we don't really have deadlines here. Just take your time. You can bring the book in next year if you get it done. I said, oh no, you'll have it in February. You'll have it. But yeah, it's. I feel enormous gratitude to be able to have someone care, and then you put the book out into the world, and you have no idea where it will go. But I was lucky. I have a great publisher.
It's great. Anyone else? Sure. That's you.
Did you ever entertain the idea of writing about your family or your father's experience directly and not through fiction?
I have 5 half-siblings, and they don't carry around automatic weapons, but they probably, I don't know if they would like it if I wrote about my family. I've thought about it, I think the spirit of my father is very present in both of the books that I wrote, and I think part of that was trying to process losing him. And my mother has certainly taught me almost everything I know about human interaction and human dynamics and emotion and communication. So everything I write, is coming from them in a certain way. But to write specifically about my own family, I haven't gotten there yet. Maybe one day.
Teresa?
I love how you take traditional male communities of the SEALs and CIA, with this beautiful feminine voice and the nuance of women writing in those worlds. And I'm wondering what community you want to delve into next.
Football.
Is that right?
Football. I don't know exactly what's next, but I've always wanted to write a football novel, and that world. There are a lot of parallels between the NFL and the veterans community. Well, not a lot, but there are two that I just have thought a lot about. One is the prevalence now of traumatic brain injury and the long tail of those costs in the NFL, and how that's played out in the veterans community. And also the long tail of having experiences in your 20s that are so dynamic and powerful, and how you then transition out of them. I'm kind of interested in that. But football is a very hard, I don't know anyone in the NFL, so football is a hard world to crack, but I don't know, maybe that'll be down the line.
So you have to get pregnant again. You got to knock on the door, right? Anyone else with a question? Sure.
Do you ever find, over the course of writing this novel, that your need to tell a story is at odds with your need to be faithful to the organizations you're portraying?
Yes. Did I ever find that wanting to tell stories from these sort of closed communities would become at odds with a sort of ethical instinct I have to be true to them? I think that is a weight that probably lies much heavier on the shoulders of people who actually served in those lines of work. I mean, one of the things about being a civilian who was never in the military or CIA and a novelist is that you have a little bit of a disclaimer. When I look back at 11 Days now, I see it written in the immediate aftermath of my father's death. So I see a kind of real rosy glow to the way that I envisioned people who serve. One critic, after that book came out, essentially accused me of being on the SEAL Team 6 payroll because I had portrayed them so heroically. And I see where that's fair. And maybe I was too afraid, but with this book, which is a darker book, I think I was more emboldened. And CIA has different kinds of complexities around people who serve, so I don't. I do feel a certain reverence for both of those communities, but I also tried to expose the dark sides. And in my experience, the folks that I spoke to, both in the military and in CIA, the really thoughtful ones, they will be the first people to tell you, this is what's wrong with us. This is where we're struggling. This is where we're having problems. They're not, neither of those two worlds, in my experience, is in the business of doing too much of a PR job. They can't. It's not part of what they do. Although some people would disagree when it comes to the Navy SEALs, but.
I'm not sure of the timing of your books and so forth, but have you dealt with or contact with people in the CIA or the military following Trump's election?
I did have some contact with folks in the CIA following Trump's election, but my book was essentially done by the end of 2016. That's been a complicated relationship from just watching it as an outsider. I think that, we have the first female director of the CIA who seems to have held very strong in terms of being who she wants to be, but it's we seem to have a president who's about whom you wouldn't use the word discreet, probably.
It's not the first word that comes to mind.
Yeah, he's so complicated to try and analyze, but I think CIA is continuing to do its job at a very high level. To some extent, who's in the Oval Office these people are still deploying in these wars. Officers are still going out and recruiting people to work for them. But in terms of the American public's view of CIA, one of the reasons that Tim Weiner's great book on CIA, Legacy of Ashes, was called Legacy of Ashes was because of this interesting phenomenon in that community, which is we only hear about the failures. The successes are quiet. So when you look at the open source history of CIA, all you see is a legacy of ashes. Now the World War II stuff is starting to, more and more of that is starting to come out, but I think everyone should feel pretty good that we have so many good people doing work for which they're not that well paid and which they're very, very skilled. But
Anybody else?
With no more questions, we just want to say a huge thank you to Kate Brosnan for helping us and to Lee Carpenter. Thank you so much.